In this secluded part of Kent, there once stood a house with a very notorious and tragic past. Suicides and murders are said to have plagued many of its inhabitants. Reports of hauntings and unexplained occurrences in the following years have put it on a par with the more famous Borley Rectory. Yet, while some houses take hold in the public imagination, this one has largely been forgotten. So what is its dark history? Did horror really stalk the walls of this seemingly tranquil corner of Kent in the house called Underhill? The fire, which raged through here in 1978, destroyed almost all traces of Underhill House. 24 firemen from across the district fought ultimately in vain to save it. The blaze was supposedly caused by an electrical fault, even though the house had stood derelict and abandoned for many years. Today, virtually nothing now remains of this once large and imposing house and its adjoining buildings. The area is still owned by the Ministry of Defence and is mainly used nowadays to stable and graze horses. Barely noticeable bumps in a green field mark out the foundations of the house, and a few scatterings of bricks here and there are all that are visible to hint at the large buildings which once stood here. The barn, home to the many horses, is all that remains standing, tucked away in the corner of the field. Lying to the west of Folkestone in the parish of Cheriton, one of the earliest mentions of the area of Underhill concerns an episode just after the English Civil War. The then Duke of Richmond was in contact with the exiled Charles II, a dangerous activity during Cromwell's Commonwealth. To avoid capture when in England, the Duke was concealed in subterraneous passages below a house owned by a Mr. Riddle in this area. The woods here came to be known locally as Richmond Shave as a result, and Mr. Riddle was eventually rewarded with the governorship of Upnor Castle after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Records show that the Brockman family acquired the land in 1794, and at some point soon after, the woods at Richmond Shave were cut down. It seems very likely that when Underhill House was eventually built, it was on the site of the aforementioned house owned by Mr. Riddle. This does provide a tantalising possibility that perhaps the subterranean passages where the Duke of Richmond once hid still exist somewhere under today's fields. Underhill House itself was eventually built in the 1840s, and it was a considerably sized property indeed. Set in almost 1.5 acres of land, it comprised 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms and 3 reception rooms. There were also substantial housing for the domestic help, with 4 bedrooms, a kitchen and a large barn. Robert Aylred Denny finally found peace from his worldly troubles in a quiet corner of a Kentish churchyard at All Saints in Lydd. Being one of 4 children, he was born into a family of some local renown and influence in 1838. His father David had been bailiff of the Town Corporation of Lydd on 23 occasions, as well as Deputy Lieutenant and Justice of the Peace for the County of Kent. In 1863, Robert Aylred Denny married Emma Mary Honeywood at St George's Square, London, and any happiness the newlyweds shared must have been increased with the arrival of their baby boy at the end of the year. However, tragedy was to strike when their young son died only a few months later. By the 1860s, when Robert Denny had moved into Underhill House with his young wife Mary, he had become a highly esteemed figure in the local community at Cheriton. Like his father before him, he too served as a local justice of the peace and a deputy lieutenant, as well as secretary for the East Kent Hunt. There was even talk of him standing for Parliament one day. Newspaper reports at the time of his death tell of his intense though groundless depression and insidious attacks of fiendish delusions. Continuous use of nitrate of silver to help control his increasing epileptic fits had given his complexion a curious bluish hue. In 1881, he suffered a very serious accident whilst out horse riding.
It seems that he was riding slightly in the rear of a lady whose horse suddenly lashed out and its hoof struck Mr. Denny just above the ankle, breaking his leg.
This series of events, the death of his son, his epilepsy, his horse riding accident, all these must have weighed heavily on his soul during those dark final days in the winter of 1887, when it appears he was convinced his world was on the verge of collapsing around him. In the weeks leading up to his death, there were many who reported noticing a drastic change in his manner and demeanour. At church, for example, when reading the lesson, people commented that he quite hesitated in his speech. Dr. Bishop, his medical attendant for 7 years, stated that he recently noticed
he seemed to be suffering from despondency
and had observed
a great alteration in his personality.
At the inquest, he stated
the deceased man was continually imagining himself a ruined man.
This was backed up by Mr. Denny's legal advisor, Mr. G. Wilkes, who was visited by him days before his death. Convinced that he was ruined and on the verge of bankruptcy, Mr. Denny was planning on selling all of his business assets, believing he had no other money to live on. Mr. Wilkes tried to allay his fears.
Mr. Denny, you are thoroughly frightened and you are not in a state of mind to take such a serious step as you suggest, which I assure you there is not the slightest necessity for.
He told him he was perfectly solvent and owed no man anything.
He came to me full of groundless fears and he seemed frightened at his own shadow.
Unfortunately, none now were able to deflect Alred Denny from his course he was set to go down. Precisely what those fears, what those terrors were, which had finally unhinged his mind, will forever remain unknown. But sometime after 10 o'clock, on the night of Friday the 26th of November 1887, Robert Alred Denny climbed the stairs to his room and finally decided to end his tortured existence on this earth with a single bullet. The doctor who attended the following morning described the scene.
There was a wound on the forehead from which blood was flowing. Deceased must have sat up in bed at the time he did the deed. It was perfectly obvious that the wound was caused by a bullet, probably fired from the revolver which was found on the bed. There was no mark of the bullet having made an exit from the head. The revolver was in the right hand, deceased's thumb being upon the trigger. Death would have been instantaneous. The pistol must have been held very close to deceased's head, if not against it. The candle had been extinguished, so that the deed must have been done in the dark.
Following the inquest into his death, Robert Aylred Denny was laid to rest in the parish church of his hometown, Lydd. His personal estate was valued at just under £13,000. In today's money, that is estimated to be well in excess of £1 million. His wife Mary donated money to the church and altar rails were built in his memory. She remained living at Underhill House until 1892, and when she passed away 12 years later, she too was interred in the same plot as her husband and their young son. The nearby military camp at Shorncliffe had been established in 1794 and had proved pivotal during the Napoleonic Wars with the arrival of Sir John Moore as its commander in 1803. It was here at Shorncliffe Camp that he instigated his new idea to train and create the Light Division, which fought under Wellington throughout the following years. The army took possession of Underhill House in the early 1900s, and it became the residency of a succession of commanding officers from Shorncliffe Camp over the years. By the 1930s, it was the home to Brigadier William Norman Herbert, and it was here that the next disaster was to strike. The murder and the suicide involving two of its domestic staff shook the walls of Underhill House in 1934. Charles Albert Jay was born in Mortby, Norfolk. His father John was a local farm steward who married Mahala Shreve at the end of 1872. In 1893, Charles was born. He was the youngest of 3 children, and by the age of 18, Charles was recorded as working as a jobbing gardener in nearby Horning. In 1914, he had joined the army in the Norfolk Regiment, and he saw active service in the first few months of World War I. It seems likely he was involved in the retreat from Mons, and was awarded the Star and Clasp. By 1926, he had started working as a valet for Brigadier Herbert, who was then commanding officer of the Northumberland Fusiliers, and Charles continued in that role when Brigadier Herbert moved to Underhill House in March 1932. Edith May Hyatt was born in the small Warwickshire village of Sherborne in 1897. She came from a large family. By 1911, Frederick and Kate Hyatt had had a family of 9, 5 daughters and 4 sons. With the oldest aged 14 and the youngest only 3, it must have been a struggle for Frederick to feed all those mouths from his meagre wage as a domestic gardener. Little is known of May's early life, but it appears her father worked as a gardener for Brigadier Herbert's sister, who lived in Warwickshire. It seems reasonable to assume that when Brigadier Herbert moved to Underhill House in the 1930s, she may well have moved with him there to work as a maid. What is known for certain is that by 1934, May Hyatt was working at Underhill House. It seems very likely that May Hyatt and Charles Jay had had some kind of relationship while they were both working at the house. But by the beginning of 1934, things had apparently started to turn sour. Brigadier Herbert was quoted as saying Charles
had been strange in his manner of late, and had been subject to fits of temper.
It appears some money had been stolen.
4 months ago, I missed some money. I spoke to him about it, and since then he's been rather strange.
On the Saturday prior to her death, Charles had asked permission from the Brigadier to take May out the following day, as it was her birthday, to which he agreed. May, however, did not appear so eager. According to the cook, Miss Louisa Grenville, she saw Charles and May at tea on that Sunday at around 5 p.m. She stated that
May seemed very undecided about going with Charles.
when asked about the relationship between the two, she commented that they had
What I call friendly jangles. I would not say they were fond of one another.
Another witness, this time Louisa Clure, the gardener's wife, confirmed this state of affairs. She said,
May had often told me that Charles wanted to marry her, but she'd refused. She had a young man at home in Warwickshire and didn't like Charles's temper.
Before leaving for dinner, Brigadier Herbert saw May in the kitchen at around 7 p.m. He was surprised to see her, believing she had gone out with Charles. They spoke briefly, then he left the house, and so May was alone with Charles at Underhill. When the cook returned to the house at around 9 o'clock, it was in darkness. She had to bang on the door to get in. The key had not been left out for her as usual.
Charles came down and opened the door, which was bolted. That was unusual. I heard him undo the bolt.
He told her May had gone down to the little shop, which she didn't understand, there being no little shop nearby. The cook offered to take May's hot water bottle up for her, but Charles was keen she not go up to May's room.
No, don't take May's,
He told her.
It's too soon. She says it gets cold.
Charles was seen next at around 9:30 in the Britannia Inn. He drank the glass of beer he ordered and left almost immediately. A witness who saw him stated,
He gave me the impression he was slightly inebriated. He certainly seemed agitated. He was very quick in his speech and he seemed upsetting himself. He was not in the usual state I'd seen him in.
It later emerged a bottle of port, a bottle of sherry and half a bottle of whiskey had gone missing from the Brigadier's sideboard. Charles must have staggered back to Underhill from the Britannia Inn, and when the Brigadier returned just after 11 o'clock, he noticed him in the kitchen, which was unusual as Charles normally went to bed very early.
I'm just writing a letter,
He told the Brigadier. By 7 a.m. the following morning, Charles had failed to call on the Brigadier as was his usual custom. He entered the Brigadier's bedroom 15 minutes late, put something on the table at the foot of the bed and left, saying he was going to get his tea. 10 minutes later, Charles had not returned, so the Brigadier called out to him. Charles replied,
I'm busy for the minute. Ask May to bring your tea.
The Brigadier then called out to May, but there was no answer. He knocked on her door, still no answer, and it was locked. Realising Charles had left the key to her room on the table at the foot of his bed, he retrieved it and he unlocked her door. It was then that he found her body. Brigadier Herbert immediately phoned the police, and within half an hour they'd arrived. Detective Constable Clough described the scene that confronted them.
The room was in order. There was no sign of disturbance. The body was left on the side of the bed, lying on its own back and fully extended. The head was inclined to the right and the tongue was hanging out of the mouth to the right side. The face was discoloured.
Hearing from the housekeeper that she had seen Charles that morning with a gun, the police burst open the door of his room and they entered. They found Charles lying on his bed.
There was a double-barrel shotgun on his left. The gun had been loaded with both barrels. The right-hand barrel had been fired. There was a shot wound on the left side of Charles's chest.
Charles was taken to the nearby military hospital at Shorncliffe Camp. By 2:30 p.m, he had died from his gunshot wounds. It appears that Charles J. murdered May Hyatt at around 8 p.m. on Sunday the 29th of April. The post-mortem examination conducted by Dr. Williamson showed
there was a mark on the right side of the neck suggestive of an indentation of the thumbs. The sides of her chest were also discoloured, and there was hemorrhage under the skin. Death was due to suffocation by choking, and partly due to compression of the chest.
After murdering her, Charles had gone to the Britannia Inn as witnessed, and on his return had written several letters. One, found in his bedroom, stated,
"It's 4:15, I have not gone yet."
Charles must have spent a night of growing horror, a realisation not only of what he'd done, but what now he needed to do. By the morning, he had procured 2 guns from the Brigadier's collection. He left one outside in the garden and taken the other to his room, where he shot himself. At the inquest, Dr. Williamson stated,
"The nature of the wound made me think the barrel must have been exceedingly close to his chest when fired. Charles had no shoes or boots on his feet. I'm of the opinion that he probably fired it with his toe."
One of Charles's letters to the Brigadier said,
"Dear Sir, I am sorry to have caused you all this trouble. Also, poor dearest May. As you know, I like May very much. There is many people after May. I hope May has gone to the right place. Good night, sir, and all my love to you."
After World War II, Underhill House remained in the possession of the military, and it continued to be the home for a succession of officers from Shorncliffe Camp. In 1972, the army had decided to sell on the property, and plans were developed to convert it into a hostel for students. However, within a few years, the building stood derelict, and as we have seen, in 1978, was largely destroyed by fire. It was not very long, however, before Underhill House began to earn some notoriety, not only for its past, but for its supposedly haunted present. One of the first writers to be attracted to Underhill House was Andrew Green. An author of several books on ghosts, Green had also achieved a small degree of fame in the media in the 70s due to his paranormal investigations. It was in his book, Ghosts of the South East, that Green introduces the story of Underhill House to the general public. Calling it Glebe House for the sake of security, he gives an appropriately spooky description of a haunted house.
"I stood in the front of the derelict empty house, looking at its square lines, the white cement facing cracking with age and the boarded up windows. The house emitted some peculiar atmosphere of dread and of silent horror. I opened the front door and predictably it squeaked. Stepping over the broken floor tiles of the porch, I entered the silent hall. The temperature dropped suddenly and I felt the hairs on the back of my head tingle."
While his account of the history of the house is largely fanciful, lacking in accuracy, and missing many basic facts, he does, however, bring 2 interesting additions to the Underhill story. He tells of a suicide by shooting of a young army lieutenant in the entrance hall just before World War I, due to excessive gambling debts. He also describes the suicide within living memory of an army padre, a lieutenant colonel. This supposedly happened in a large storage airing cupboard, where the padre, distraught at the merging of his regiment, hung himself from a water pipe. Unfortunately, as it appears his take on the history of the house is mainly based on hearsay rather than any actual research, this must throw into serious question his accounts of these 2 further suicides. No evidence has ever been found to confirm a soldier's suicide due to gambling debts in Underhill House around World War I, though unfortunately there are several reports of soldiers committing suicide at Shorncliffe Camp during this time. Likewise, no evidence has ever turned up regarding the hanging of the army padre. A Freedom of Information request in 2017 with the Ministry of Defence failed to find any evidence for any of these deaths. Numerous books have followed over the years, most repeating if not embellishing many of the earlier tales first mentioned in Andrew Green's book. Some authors stooping to simply making up sensational facts to no doubt try and help improve sales. In one book, for example, it states that the padre, who supposedly hung himself, had actually performed an exorcism at Underhill, and adds an extra suicide victim with a gruesome hanging in the stable, assertions for which no sources nor any evidence have ever been produced. Green's book is useful, however, in being one of the first to chronicle some of the hauntings supposedly to have occurred at Underhill House. 2 young women are said to have seen a soldier come out of the wall in the room they were sleeping and glide down the corridor. A char lady, on hearing footsteps in an empty corridor, just caught sight of a woman entering a bedroom, but when she followed, it was empty. A heavy laundry basket, too heavy for 2 students to carry, disappeared, only to be discovered upstairs outside the large airing cupboard. Cutlery laid out for dinner guests mysteriously disappears. It is replaced and then later disappears again. The figure of a man in a pepper and salt suit is seen in the doorway to the cellar. Andrew Green tells of a personal experience he had visiting the derelict house in October 1974 with 2 others.
We started to go down the stairs, Bill first, me following, and Dick immediately behind, when we all heard the sudden tinkling of glass in the corridor. Dick and I both saw a lamp bulb, some 10 feet away, rocking on the floor. It was warm when I picked it up, yet it could not have been used as the electricity supply had been cut off some months earlier. The filament was still intact, so what, we wondered, caused the sound?
Thanks to the resources held in Folkestone Library's Heritage Room and the research undertaken by its staff, the bones of the story of Underhill House and the tragedies of Alred Denny, Charles J. and May Hyatt have finally been made flesh. For the truths of the other tales, of the suicides, of the hauntings, as yet nothing has been found to substantiate them. The idyllic setting where Underhill House once stood today betrays little of its unpleasant history. Yet that inherent strangeness that can sometimes be felt in the English countryside is all too present here. The ghost of the building itself hovers just out of sight over the hedgerows that lead down to the Britannia Inn. The wind rushing through the empty fields carries the sounds from far away, from long ago, and, if you are still enough, if you listen, they can just be heard. The old barn crouches ominously behind the low wall, and the solitary white horse, seemingly ever present in the field, keeps watch over this land.